And thank you for coming to the next event in the Research Group on Constitutional Studies lecture series. The RGCS lecture series, supported by a generous grant to McGill from the Aurea Foundation, aims to bring leading researchers in the social sciences, law, philosophy, and history who work at the intersection of more than one discipline among those fields, very often political theory and social science, political theory and law, philosophy and law. It aims to bring leading researchers to present work in a way that is accessible to a broad student audience on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society. The Research Group on Constitutional Studies more broadly is a research community that brings together faculty, graduate students, and an undergraduate fellowship from across political theory and political science, philosophy, and law for inquiry into the structure and values of constitutionalism, asking both questions about the foundations of political order and the ways in which political societies are constituted and have values and ideals embedded into their organization, and, in the ancient sense of constitutionalism, the way in which political societies and forms of government align with the societies that they aim to govern. RGCS, in turn, is a part of the newly established Jan P. Linde Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds, a center that will be bringing together normative, comparative, and historical kinds of humanistic social inquiry from across the whole university, ranging from law to philosophy to classics to architecture, into a series of allied research groups studying the character of social order and social organization very broadly understood. The RGCS lecture series is now in its fourth year, and this is the second in this year's events. The next will be given in 2 weeks from right now, by Philippe Lagacé from Political Science at the University of Ottawa, on the separation of powers and the status of the Crown in the Canadian Constitution, with more events later this year by Jenna Bednar from the University of Michigan, who will give a lecture in the winter on federalism, and by Cécile Fabre and Eric Mack from Oxford and Tulane, respectively, who will have a public debate on the nature and character of property and ownership in the spring. The Jan P. Linde Center will have its inaugural event on April 13th, when the Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson will give a lecture on the character of freedom in the ancient and modern worlds. For today, we're very pleased to welcome Richard Boyd, who is Associate Professor of Government at Georgetown University. He's held teaching appointments at the University of Wisconsin at Madison, at Deep Springs College, University of Pennsylvania, and the University of Chicago. He holds a PhD from Rutgers. He's the author of the very valuable book, Uncivil Society, The Perils of Pluralism and the Making of Modern Liberalism. He is a co-editor of Tocqueville and the Frontiers of Democracy, co-author of one book under preparation called Subprime Virtues, The Moral Foundations of American Housing and Mortgage Policy, and another from which I suspect today's lecture is in part drawn, called Liberalism, Capacities, and Citizenship. He is the author of some dozens of articles and book chapters on topics ranging through the history of political thought, contemporary liberal theory, and its applications to public policy. And he is, among other things, the faculty director of the program in social and political thought at Georgetown University. Please join me in welcoming Richard Boyd.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to thank Jacob for that warm welcome, and the Center for hosting me for this talk, and for all of you coming out on, I know, a very chilly, rainy day to hear some thoughts about immigration. So I guess before I begin, I want to start off with a couple of caveats, maybe two of them in mind in particular, and you'll be the judge of whether there should have been more caveats afterwards, but at least two that I want to emphasize. First, Jacob asked me to try to keep this as informal as possible in the sense of making it accessible. So rather than reading a formal academic paper, I thought I would try to organize this more along the lines of an informal talk where I go through and raise some points, and then I hope if I've said some provocative things, we can come back and talk about them afterward. The second caveat is also that, well, I'm going to try to talk about citizenship and immigration at a generic level, right? Try to think about these things as broad concepts, universal concepts. I think inevitably my account of immigration and my account of citizenship is going to be inflected by some kind of American focus, or if not an American bias. So I hope that insofar as I'm raising issues of liberal citizenship and making assumptions based on an American context, and that citizenship in Canada may work out differently, I hope that people will keep this in mind and raise this as an issue, because it might be productive to think about how American citizenship and Canadian citizenship, while I think of them as various different species of liberal citizenship, that there might not, in fact, be important nuances. So I say that as a couple of caveats from the get-go. So let me just sort of give an overview of the talk that I want to give. There are really four main points, or four main sections to my talk. I just want to say a little bit about each one of them, and then I'll jump in and go through point by point. So in the first section of my talk, I want to talk about three different liberal myths about citizenship. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by myths in a second, but essentially ways in which I think liberalism and liberal political philosophy have led us to misunderstand the nature of citizenship and led us to think things about citizenship that are, in some respects, false, or at least minimal misleading. In the second section of the talk, I want to suggest a different way of looking at citizenship through the lens of liberalism, a way that draws more upon the history of liberal ideas and the history of political thought. And that different alternative way is what I call the capabilities approach. So I'll say more about that when I get into the section. In the third part of the paper, I want to try to draw upon the resources of the liberal tradition and draw upon this idea of a capabilities approach to citizenship and to immigration to try to see what the implications are for contemporary debates and contemporary discourse on immigration. So I think that'll be, I hope, the more topical, the more contemporaneous part of the talk. And then in the fourth section, I want to step back a little bit and think about the problem that mainly concerns me, and that's the problem of exclusion. In what way does this capabilities approach draw our attention to various instances and opportunities for exclusion and the ways in which justifications are made for closing borders, for excluding either all immigrants or, in some cases, just certain groups of immigrants. So that's a broad outline of what I want to try to accomplish. Just check my time here. Okay, so the three liberal myths about citizenship. I use the term myth very carefully, and I have a very specific idea in mind when I talk about myths. The idea of myths here draws upon George Sorel's notion of a myth. And for Sorel, myths really have two main significances. First of all, myths are false, right? There's some way in which things are mythical are, if not patently false, then at least exaggerations or misrepresentations of underlying social reality. But the thing that Sorel found so significant about myths was not simply that they were false, but that they had great social power, right? That the myths get inside our minds and they lead us to think about the world in a way that actually changes our social vantage and leads us to misreckon or misunderstand social practices. So I think a lot of the stories drawn from liberal political philosophy about citizenship and about where freedom comes from and what it is that entitles us to be members of particular political communities are based on ideas from liberalism that are at least somewhat mythical. So I want to go through and talk about three of those to get things started. So the first of these liberal myths that I don't think is particularly helpful and is maybe outright misleading in terms of what it is that makes somebody a member of a political community is the idea that liberty is something that is natural, that it is something that's universal, that it's something that's cosmopolitan, that there are these things called natural rights or human rights that human beings are entitled to simply by virtue of being human beings. And that's very much a mainstay of 17th and 18th century classical classical liberal political thought, right? Human beings are born free and endowed with these natural rights, and that this is something that's simply inherent in our humanity. I think that idea has a great rhetorical appeal. I think there's also something problematic about that. Just one example of this case in point, Jefferson's second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't want to deny the resonance, right, the rhetorical influence of something like this cosmopolitan universalistic idea. But the problem, as thinkers as different as Edmund Burke on the right and Jeremy Bentham on the left all pointed out, is that the idea, in some sense at least, is patently wrong, right, patently false. That in point of fact, liberty is not so much some kind of universal metaphysical postulate that people are endowed with as human beings. Rather, it's a specific legal privilege that adheres to certain people who happen to be born members of particular political communities that have both the institutional wherewithal as well as the political will to protect their rights. Right? Absent that, as Hannah Arendt pointed out in her thoughts on the predicament of statelessness in the early 20th century, one is, as a human being, merely subject to predation, to genocide, to indeed a loss of humanity. So I guess the important point I would emphasize is that citizenship is not something that somehow creates rights, right? Rights are not something, or freedom is not something that creates citizenship in some way, but rather it's the other way around. Citizenship undergirds rights. It's through citizenship that we access those rights and those freedoms. And just a somewhat glib idea to throw out there, I was trying to think about this idea, what's an analogy for this, of the status of this idea of human rights. And I always think of Santa Claus, right? No one would deny the power of Santa Claus as a kind of intersubjective phenomenon to help us organize our lives and help us to orient our conduct and to celebrate a particular Christian holiday. But in point of fact, unless someone actually gets up on the couch and goes to Toys R Us, or I guess these days goes online to Amazon or something and orders up some presents, it's going to be a mighty chilly Christmas, right? So Santa Claus, right? I sort of liken the idea of human rights or natural rights to Santa Claus, right? That one has to have some other kind of intermediary mechanism in order to get people access to them, and I think that's citizenship. But I think it exists in some kind of indeterminate relationship to this idea of human rights. So the second myth then, and it's closely connected to the first myth I've identified, is the story that we're familiar with from classical liberalism of a social contract, or the notion that consent somehow plays some role in figuring out how people get citizenship or entitled to citizenship. So the familiar liberal story, the story that the United States we often tell about ourselves, and I gather that it's probably part also of the Canadian self-understanding of Canada as a kind of quote-unquote civic nation, that is, nations where membership is predicated not on being of a particular ethnic extraction, but rather is at least ideally about subscribing to certain common civic ideals, that this idea of civic nations is really a kind of fiction. It's a sort of story that we tell ourselves, and that consent doesn't really play much of a role at all. So where does this come from? Well, there's the great contractarian stories of the 17th century, Locke's second treatise, where there's a state of nature somehow, and people come in from the state of nature and consent with one another to form a government and are obliged because of their consent. In the 18th century, Tom Paine's Common Sense and other kind of generic version of this contractarian story. But if you sort of think about how this tracks on to actual membership in real political communities, I think it's fascinating that consent plays very little role in determining how most of us acquire our citizenship, right? In fact, I'll go so far as to say consent is neither a necessary nor is it a sufficient condition for citizenship, for membership in a particular political community. What I mean by that, at least in the United States, the vast majority of people who are U.S. citizens have never consented to citizenship, right? You're just born a citizen. Nobody at any point in your life really makes you come and sign somewhere on the dotted line. Yes, I accept the American citizenship that I've been given. So unless you're a naturalized citizen, somewhat unusual circumstance, consent plays no necessary role. Nor is it sufficient. Right? If you think about the millions, if not tens of millions of people around the world who would be happy to show up at the borders of a nation like the U.S. or a nation like Canada and hold up their right hands and swear some oath affirming their commitment to something like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, many people, in fact, try that. Many people try to get around the fact that that doesn't work. Right? So it's not sufficient. Right? That in and of itself does not, in fact, entitle you to citizenship. So I guess the reality of it, and notwithstanding this liberal narrative or the story that we want to tell about civic nations and the role of consent and all of this, the reality is that most liberal citizens derive their membership by virtue of unchosen or ascriptive criteria, the fact of who their parents are and the legal status of their parents, or in other cases, the fact of being born on a particular piece of soil, a particular piece of territory. Doctrines of jus sanguinis on the one hand, jus soli on the other, that seem difficult, if not impossible, to square with usual liberal stories and liberal narratives and liberal principles. That leads directly into the third of these liberal myths that I wanted to raise, and it's maybe a more contemporaneous understanding of liberalism, but I think it's also part of the liberal narrative of the world, that somehow citizenship is based on principles of justice, if not some ideal of fairness. Maybe the most familiar contemporary iteration of liberalism is that of John Rawls, and especially Rawls's idea of justice as fairness. And a complicated idea, and I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on Rawls lest I lose myself, but justice as fairness has a number of different attributes to it, the priority of liberty, the difference principle, but the part I have in mind here is Rawls's doctrine of fair equality of opportunity. And in a nutshell, that simply means that when it's a matter of allocating positions in society, those positions ought to be open to all, irrespective of their race, of their ethnicity, of their gender, of their sexual orientation, of their conditions of disability, or any other unchosen aspect of their identities that they themselves have no control over. And we sort of assume that liberal institutions allocate goods on the basis of something at least roughly resembling fair equality of opportunity. And yet, as many critics have observed, not only does nationality is an attribute of our identity that shapes our life prospects much more than our relative position within a given society, but it's dictated almost wholly by morally arbitrary features, right? The fact of who your parents were, what their legal status was, or in a nuance of the idea of birthright citizenship, by the pure dumb accident of where you happen to fall from your mother's womb. So, right, in what sense is there fairness involved in the idea of a child who happens to be born 500 feet north of the Rio Grande River in New Mexico, whose life prospects are much more robust than another child who happens to be born 500 feet south of exactly that same river in Mexico proper? It seems almost impossible to square any idea of citizenship on these kind of ordinary principles of justice as fairness. So I'm just kind of trying to touch on or sketch these ideas out as being, at best, not very helpful in trying to understand principles by which we get citizenship, or how citizenship and immigration ought to be regulated. And in fact, they might in fact be positively detrimental to our understanding, because they encourage us to think about the principles of citizenship and think about the ways in which we deal with immigration policies as being much more liberal than they actually are in practice, right? Rather than acknowledging that the distribution of citizenship is governed by these principles that are, if not unfair, then at least arbitrary, it encourages us to think that there's something open or something robust or something liberal about the political communities in which most of us live. So that's, I guess, on these three myths. So by way of responding to that, I want to try to then, in the next section of the paper, in the next section of my talk, to draw upon a different understanding, a different way of using the liberal tradition that I could describe as the capabilities approach. And the point here is to look back at the history of liberal thought and try to derive something that's more helpful and more useful in two ways. First, more helpful and more useful in getting us to better understand the principles by which we do allocate citizenship, particularly when it's a matter of choosing new members of our society. And then secondly, to try to perhaps give us some guidance in terms of how we ought to do so, right? Or at least the things that we ought to try to avoid, those pitfalls of exclusion that I'll get around back to momentarily. So going back to my first point about this idea of liberalism being ostensibly cosmopolitan, all about human beings somehow abstracted without any personal characteristics or personal qualities, I think in some sense that's not quite right. That it's not quite right to say that classical liberal thinkers were completely, altogether agnostic as to the question of what entitles somebody to be a member of a free society or to be a member in good standing of a liberal political community. Whether implicitly or, in some cases, explicitly, classical liberal thinkers as different as John Locke, as Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, even in some respects John Rawls, have actually identified a number of different characterological requirements that they think are necessary for somebody to be truly free or to be a member in good standing of a liberal political community. The insight here that I want to try to do a little bit more to develop, I have to confess I didn't come up with this insight myself, but I'm really building upon the work of people like Uday S. Mehta and other post-colonial critics who have really tried to drill down into this notion that there's something universalistic or cosmopolitan about liberalism. And the basic point that Mehta has come up with in his work, criticizing John Locke and John Stuart Mill and other liberals, is that rather than liberalism operating under this veneer of universality and this veneer of cosmopolitanism, liberal thinkers have always assumed that there's certain requisite qualities, requisite character components that people have to have in order to be truly entitled to freedom. He calls these anthropological minimums, right? Certain things like rationality, or certain things like autonomy, or certain things like self-reliance, or certain things like civilization, that liberal thinkers have presupposed as being necessary for somebody to be truly free, right? To be a full-fledged member of a liberal society. So I just want to draw attention to a few thinkers in the liberal tradition who seem to have been either explicit or interestingly implicit, right, about what these characterological capabilities, what these capacities really are. And I'll mention just three of them here to try to give you some sense of where this line of thinking goes. The first I want to mention, and I know I'm getting myself in hot water here, but the first thinker I want to mention is Thomas Hobbes. And I can see Professor Levy already over here. He's going to hasten to raise his hand, immediately remind me that Thomas Hobbes is, in fact, not a liberal thinker. He and I have had a very warm debate over this exact issue for the past 15, 20 years now. I think we've agreed to agree, actually. I've come around to your way of thinking. That's the best way to say it. I'm not trying to say, I'll keep myself out of trouble. I'm not trying to say that Hobbes is a liberal thinker, right, strictly speaking, but that he's, in important ways, a proto-liberal thinker whose ideas of a social contract and whose ideas of membership in a political community anticipate later classical liberal thinkers such as John Locke, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You let me get away with that. So what is it then that Hobbes identifies as being a characterological requirement for membership in a political community, liberal or otherwise? Hobbes assumes that citizens, or subjects in his terms, are people who are concerned first and foremost with the preservation of their lives, and then a corollary of that for him is that they therefore respect the lives of other people. They are law-abiding, first and foremost, orderly in some way, civil in the way in which they treat their fellow subjects with some degree of respect. And then the flip side of that for Hobbes, of course, is that for individuals who do not manifest those very, very minimal qualities of orderliness and concern for their own lives and respect for the lives of other people, it's right and proper to expel them in some way from the political community. So Hobbes' example of this, the metaphor he uses is someone building a fence out of stones that they've found themselves in the ground. And the idea is that you find some way of fitting all the stones in together so that they form a very solid edifice. But he acknowledges that sometimes there will be some stone that, because of its oddness of shape or asperity, A-S-P-E-R-I-T-Y, simply doesn't fit in with the rest. And he says it must be cast aside as useless, right? So there's some way in which, even based on these very, very minimal assumptions about what characterological requirements people need to have in a political community, even Hobbes acknowledges that some people might not qualify. Moving on then into John Locke. I think Locke is much more robust in terms of sketching out what these ideal qualities are. Locke is somebody I already associated with the state of nature view, the consent theory view. But it's also interesting to observe in Locke's state of nature that while he starts off with the state of nature where everybody is seemingly free and equal, very quickly Locke's state of nature diverges into two separate groups of people. There are the quote-unquote rational industrious people, right? The ones whom Locke praises as somehow apotheosizing the quality and character necessary for living in a free society. Those who can be trusted by their faculty of reason to abide by the laws of nature. But these are to be distinguished from these other characters whom he calls the quarrelsome and contentious. The foxes and polecats. They even cease to be human for Locke. Foxes and polecats. Noxious creatures, he calls them, who must be exterminated or enslaved or otherwise driven out and expelled. So for Locke, very clearly a canon of certain characterological requirements. Rationality, right, being able to guide one's actions by reason. Industriousness, hard work, the willingness to labor. Autonomy, someone who's not liable to become dependent on others or rely upon welfare, public assistance, etc. Lastly, and then fast forwarding a little bit to the 19th century, John Stuart Mill, again, presupposes, maybe much more explicitly either than Hobbes or Locke or other liberals, presupposes that in order to be free, in order to be entitled to all these fulsome liberties that he talks about in such glowing and seeming unqualified terms and on liberty, one has to in fact be a member of a particular civilization, or at least a requisite level of civilization that one could be improved by free and equal discussion. And as he says, sort of slips it in very early on in chapter 1 of On Liberty, as for all the rest of those people out there, the people who are childlike or primitive in some way, the backward, barbarous, savage peoples of the world, they're to be given an Akbar or a Charlemagne, if they're so fortunate as to find one. So very clearly a benchmark of civilization that entitles one to freedom, and then below some level one's subject to various forms of colonial exclusion. So then, if that's how this sort of capabilities, these insights, this capabilities approach emerges in the liberal tradition, I want to turn now to the idea that this is not just an artifact of classical liberalism, right? This is not just a kind of curiosity or word games or a philosophical trick that's at work back in the 17th and 18th century, but that in fact these assumptions have found their way into contemporary liberalism and are particularly relevant in instances where liberal political communities have to come up with reasons for either excluding or including new members, right? When it's a matter of those of us who are already members, we sometimes slip into this discourse of a good citizen versus a bad citizen, but I think that's something that's really very far at the margins. Whereas when it's a matter of admitting someone new into a political community, it's a matter of sorting out among all those would-be applicants for citizenship, suddenly these ideas about capabilities emerge, and sometimes emerge in ways that are quite, I guess, illuminating on the one hand, sometimes very ugly on the other hand. So what I want to try to do is then suggest that these assumptions remain very much with us today, for better or worse, in contemporary discourse on immigration and citizenship. And I want to say a little bit about the for better, right, to suggest maybe what the more positive or affirmative side of this capabilities approach would lead toward, and then turn in the remainder of my talk to the bad side of it, the ways in which this, I think, lays the groundwork for various forms of exclusion and various arguments for more closed borders, if not absolutely closed borders, and for the exclusion of certain groups of people. So on the positive side, if we assume, like Michael Walzer, that citizenship is the primary good in a society, it's membership in a political community which grants us access to all those other goods, and that as current members of the political community, we're in a kind of privileged position in being able to make judgments about, among the many would-be members of our community, which ones we're going to choose to let in and for what reasons, then I think it's incumbent upon us to think a little bit about what kinds of would-be citizens we'd want to look for. Or to put it differently, what capabilities are we really expecting from people who want to be members of our political community? Looking at this through this lens, I think allows us to identify different kinds of immigrants, right? The kinds of skills, the kinds of dispositions, the kinds of characterological requirements we'd expect from would-be citizens. So just a little bit to sketch out how this might work, or to how different ways in which one could play off this capabilities approach to try to construct something like a prudent and a moral immigration policy. First, I think most of us in a very, very broad sense would agree that if it's a matter of a zero-sum game, and that we have to, at the margins at least, exclude some people, that we do far better including people who exemplify some of these liberal capabilities, right? People who are hardworking and industrious, as opposed to people who are what Locke would deem quarrelsome and contentious. That seems to be one of the easiest cuts that one could possibly make. But even the capabilities approach raises some other hard issues and some hard trade-offs. For example, what about a matter of choosing, if we can't take everyone, we have to make a difficult choice between taking in the people who are the most economically industrious, the people who are the most hardworking, most ambitious, most gifted, most skilled, versus letting in other people who, maybe in a more minimal Hobbesian sense, have less to offer to the political community, but are in desperate need of preserving their own lives. Right? There's some way in which these different characterological or capacities potentially cut in different directions and raise hard questions about which of those things we'd want to privilege. And then maybe even in a more complicated fashion, What about groups of people who maybe are very, very industrious and very, very economically oriented and very hard workers and very skilled, but at least according to some come from or represent civilizational traditions that don't have an easy or an automatic affinity for liberal democracy or liberal democratic ideals? People who, say, are interested in the economic prospects of citizenship and not so much on the shared political culture or other values associated with living in a political community. How does one in some sense, mediate between those different imperatives? So I don't have any good answers for that, other than that seems to be some of the issues, the very live issues that we struggle with in trying to craft something like a sensible and a humane and an efficient immigration policy. I want to turn then to the for the worse part of it, right? The way in which this capabilities approach remains with us today and leads in very, very, I think, ugly and unfortunate directions toward exclusion. This is implicit in what I've said before, but let me just reinforce the point and maybe make it even more dramatic. For almost any of these capabilities that we can identify, there is a flip side, right? For every group of people that we could identify as being industrious, rational, civilizationally inclined toward our way of looking at the world, there is an invidious other, right? There is the lazy, the indolent, the group who is alleged to be liable toward public assistance, the irrational, the uncivilized, the criminal, right? The disorderly. The flip side, the invidious other of the very pantheon of virtues that most of us would agree are important and the things that we should privilege, generate categories, groups, qualities that can then be, in certain ways, right, stereotypically attributed to certain groups, right? So I think this is one of the ways in which the capabilities approach is something we need to pay close attention to because it does lead to very unfortunate situations. So one doesn't have to dig very far into contemporary discourse about immigration to find lots of characterizations, very, very ugly and vivid characterizations of immigrants, both, I should say, documented as well as undocumented, as lazy, as destined to become economically dependent, as criminals, as lawbreakers. You probably already can figure out where I'm going with this, who I have in mind here. As of late, the most infamous, though by no means the only advocate of this view, is a certain American reality star / real estate mogul. And I can't believe I'm quoting Donald Trump in my political theory talk here, but Donald Trump has recently said, we all sort of know the quote, but it's worth, in this context, revisiting it. Speaking of immigrants from Mexico, they're not sending us their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with them. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. I wish I could do a better Trump accent to really hit this home. I don't even know why, given what he said, some, I assume, are good people, right? Why you need to qualify that in the way that you do, anyway, he said it, he's refused to take it back, and he's not the only one who's saying or thinking those things. The implication, of course, for Trump is that a willingness to violate our immigration laws, that is to be in America undocumented or illegal, is somehow indicative of a deeper characterological problem or even some kind of congenital criminality. And here, again, I wish I could say that Trump was singular in this belief, in this attempt to kind of conflate violators of immigration with murderers and rapists and gang members and drug dealers. But if you want another, maybe even more lurid example of this, Jim Gilchrist's Minutemen Project, it's something been around for 20 or so years. If you go to the website, in addition to featuring lots of nativist-type op-ed pieces, there's a regular kind of news feed where they gather up stories around the country where criminals have committed some particularly lurid crimes, and these criminals also happen to be illegal, undocumented aliens, illegal immigrants, etc. And it's very clear what's trying to be done here, that there's a certain element of social construction that's gone on, that if a gang member happens to be Salvadoran, then in some kind of bad obverse logic, right, what's that, obverse fallacy, then therefore Salvadorans must all be gang members, right? It's a very, very clear, explicit attempt to try to link immigrants, especially undocumented aliens, with crime, criminality, with some deeper propensity toward crime. And so I think Trump is really doing nothing more than just giving voice to kind of age-old lament. I hesitate to bring up the following name in the same breath as Donald Trump, because he's somebody who I admire among the founding fathers, somebody who I think generally was on the egalitarian Republican side of most issues. But even Benjamin Franklin was not unconcerned about the quality of immigrants coming to the United States in early America. In what can Britain show a more sovereign contempt for us than by emptying their jails into our settlements? Unless they would likewise empty their jakes, which I guess was a euphemism at the time for chamber pots, right? Empty their chamber pots onto our dinner tables, right? So, by way of contrast, right, Franklin says, the Germans, whom he usually badmouth, have their virtues. Their industry and frugality is exemplary. They're excellent husbandmen and contribute greatly to the improvement of a country. So what's at stake here in this juxtaposition between English convicts on the one hand and German farmers on the other? We have here already the beginnings of a construction of a good immigrant, a model immigrant, an immigrant who is deserving of being here, even above the fact that they may not speak our language or they may have other characterological issues that Franklin has trouble with. They're eminently deserving of being here precisely because they apotheosize the liberal virtues, the characterological requirements that we stand for in a community like the United States. And then the flip side of that, another group of people, I guess Englishmen, with whom we expect to have some kind of, ethnic or broader sense of family relationship, who are bad immigrants because they allegedly suffer from some kind of criminality, some kind of deviance, some kind of liability to become public charges. So the thing I want to just emphasize here is that the irony is that the very same, notwithstanding the different attributions to English convicts on the one hand and German farmers on the other, what's being appealed to here is the very same constellation of capabilities, right? The very same assumptions that what we're looking for are a certain sort of people who manifest a certain set of virtues. And depending on how one constructs different groups, one can either use the very same liberal criteria to either include or exclude, again, right, depending on how certain groups are constructed. Maybe the causes aren't genetic or racial, doing it with stock, right, as Franklin sometimes hinted, so much as a matter of culture. And I think among the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson is actually a bit cleaner on this issue, a bit more forthcoming about this. Jefferson, as he famously worried about immigrants from European monarchies, he worries they'll bring with them the principles of the government they leave, imbibed in their early youth. These principles with their language they'll transmit to their children. In proportion to their numbers, they'll share with us in the legislation, infuse into it their spirit, warp and bias its direction, and render it a heterogeneous, incoherent, distracted mass. Now, it's important to note, and I want to make sure I qualify this, it's important to note that neither Franklin nor Jefferson allowed these characterological misgivings to dictate some kind of absolute prohibition against immigration. Right? Jefferson said we should not prohibit them from coming, but neither should we engage in any extraordinary inducement. But I think it's only a short leap from these assessments of the unsuitability of many immigrant groups to liberal membership to the anti-immigration conclusions of somebody like, say, Samuel Huntington, for whom recent arrivals from Latin America or Mexico allegedly lack these Anglo-Protestant values: individuality, ambition, hard work, independence, moral rectitude, a respect for education. And something about recent immigrant groups. There's always some new group that's qualitatively different from the groups that came beforehand, who are ostensibly unassimilable, right? They simply cannot or will not accede to these Anglo-Protestant values, and thus they're in some way destined to adulterate or to weaken the civic culture that maintains a country, United States, Canada, whatever makes it great. So then I guess turning directly from that to some broader conclusions from all of this, I want to say a little bit more, stepping back from the details of it and think more generally about the pitfalls of exclusion that I think the liberal tradition allows us to identify and to highlight. So the first point about this is that virtually any criteria or any moral expectations that we set for immigrants are liable to the creation of others. That is, that we can then find certain groups of individuals who either actually do lack these requisite capacities or capabilities or faculties, or, I guess as more often the case, are alleged to or constructed as lacking them. So as such, I think we need to be as worried about the abuses of these criteria as we do as the legitimacy of the criteria themselves. So you can think about this as being a kind of a two-tiered effort. You want to try to identify what are indeed the qualities, the characteristics that we want to have in new members of our society, and to try to identify individuals who have those requisite capacities, and yet recognize and be self-aware that in doing so, and in particularly in showcasing those, you unwittingly create the very categories and the very ammunition that can, with certain stereotypical generalizations, be used to argue for excluding, right, closing borders against other groups of people. So it's a double-edged sword, I guess, if you will, and we have to be attentive to both sides of it. That being said, and my second broader conclusion about all this, not all of these capacities, I would submit, are as susceptible to exclusion as others. And I'm speaking in very, very general terms here, and this is a broader argument in and of itself, but I'll just lay the argument out here without all the supporting points. Generally speaking, I would submit the higher that we set the bar, that is, the more stringent or demanding we are in terms of these requisite capabilities, the more likely it is that we end up excluding some identifiable groups of people. And let me just give you a quick example of that, again, facing back to a couple of the thinkers in the history of political thought. So think about the Hobbesian account, right? For Hobbes, very, very minimal things that we expect from our fellow citizens. We at minimum want to make sure, I guess like Donald Trump, right, that we're not letting in murderers and rapists and gang members and drug dealers, right? That doesn't seem to be too much to ask. But the problem is, I guess, that these questions of law-abidingness, well, let me put it the other way around. The good part of that, right, the thing that I find most reassuring about the Hobbesian account and setting the bar so incredibly low is that it seems that issues of law-abidingness or criminality are relatively empirical issues, and they're things that are relatively falsifiable, right? So if it turns out that there are people in the United States or the people in Canada who are murderers or rapists or criminals, then it seems relatively straightforward that we identify those individuals who are in fact murderers and rapists and drug dealers, and we either arrest them, detain them, punish them, or throw them out of the country by virtue of the fact that they are indeed, right, the criminals that they're alleged to be. So it seems that not to say that one can't then, on the basis of this, make broader stereotypical allegations. We've seen, case in point, our friend Donald Trump. But I think that there is some way in which the minimal Hobbesian account is less liable to being stretched, right? Either you're a murderer or you're not a murderer, right? It's a relatively easily identifiable thing. In my view, this is more reassuring, that is less liable to exclusion than these broad Millian or Huntingtonian arguments about civilizational affinities, right? How is one supposed to establish that one has an affinity for American civilization? Or how is one deemed that one is somebody who's capable of acquiring Anglo-Protestant values, whatever those actually are, whatever that means? I worry about the nebulous, amorphous quality of these kinds of arguments not just of Huntington, but arguments of people like Michael Walzer, people like David Miller and others, who appeal to broad ideas of some distinctive national culture that will allegedly, never quite specified how or how much, be adulterated in some way if we let in sufficient numbers of certain kinds of people. It just seems to me that these arguments are so broad, so vague, so all-encompassing that they're non-falsifiable, and thus I tend to worry more about the exclusionary potential of those sorts of arguments than a very, very bare-bones Hobbesian account. So I guess to go back to Uday Mehta's terms about anthropological minimums, in this case, when it's a matter of anthropological minimums, minimal really is better, i.e. less exclusionary. And then lastly, one other observation about all this, one argument that's sometimes made in favor of these capacities and the kinds of arguments that I've been describing is that they're okay, they pass muster, because they're characterological or cultural rather than racialized. Right? So Donald Trump would say, or Samuel Huntington does say, that they're not racist, right? They're not saying that they don't like Mexicans or they don't like some other particular immigrant group because there's something racial about that group. It's just that certain groups of people happen to come from parts of the world where they don't have the same cultural baggage, right, or certain cultural virtues as the rest of us. And so I think we're puzzled by that. Well, okay, it's not really racism, and yet at some other level it rests upon stereotypes that are undoubtedly have some semblance at least to racism. But I think one of the things that I draw from this, one conclusion I draw from looking at some of this material, is we have to realize that cultural arguments, right, these supposedly social scientific objective arguments that appeal to political culture can be in their effects just as exclusionary as race, if not more so. So one of the things that's so striking, if you go back and look at one of the classic anti-immigration screeds, Edward Allsworth Ross, a real piece of work if ever there was one, Edward Allsworth Ross's Old World in the New from 1914, where he indulges in all kinds, he was a very, very grotesque scientific racist, and all kinds of racial attributions to the peoples of this part of the world are like this, and the Slavs are like that, and the Magyars are like this, and the people are like that, and the Tartars are like this. And it's horrible, horrible, horrible stuff. It's almost unreadable. But in terms of what he's appealing to, right, the constellation of virtues that he deems to be, like Samuel Huntington, distinctively Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-Protestant, even though the basis is racial, the argument is exactly the same, right? There's some new group of people coming along who allegedly are going to dilute whatever essence or whatever quality came along with our race / political culture. So I think exclusionary arguments in immigration are in both cases otherwise identical. Culture can be a proxy for race and can operate and function in exactly the same kinds of invidious and exclusionary ways. So with that, I guess I will conclude on that rather gloomy note, cautionary note. I intend it to be cautionary, not gloomy. And I'll stop at this point and see if there are questions. So thank you very much.
At these lectures, the first question is reserved for a member of the RGCS Student Fellowship. And please turn on the microphone when you ask a question and off when you're done. Oh, sorry.
So in the Hobbesian account, do you think that, so Hobbes is more minimalist about exclusion because also his account of government is that government can exercise more control over its people, like he believes in absolute sovereignty, whereas in the Lockean account he's less minimalist about exclusion in the sense that, for example, he calls for not tolerating Catholics or atheists in society, and he wants more of a restrained government. So I'm wondering, like, would the nature of the regime impact methods of exclusion in political society?
Yeah, the easy answer is yes, and I think that's a very interesting question. Most of the thinkers that I'm talking about draw from broadly the liberal, the classical liberal, the proto-liberal tradition, and I think you put your finger on perhaps one distinction that one can see already within that tradition, but I think this is particularly clear when you look outside the liberal tradition and you juxtapose some of these liberal assumptions about what we expect from citizens from the Republican assumptions about what we expect from citizens. So other thinkers in the Republican tradition, like the Republican tradition in the United States, assumed that in order to be a full-fledged citizen, you had to not just be hardworking and rational and autonomous, you had to be a citizen soldier, right? You had to be economically independent. So there are other traditions, especially insofar as the traditions presuppose more on the part of citizens in terms of their own self-government and in terms of their own engagement and their own participation. They end up ratcheting up the assumptions much, much higher. So look at all the kinds of exclusions in the American tradition that were done in the name of republicanism. You know, women can't fight in the military, therefore women shouldn't be able to vote. Or certain classes of people aren't economically independent, and therefore they shouldn't have the same right to participate in the political process as others. So I think moving from that big difference between the Republican tradition and then various species of the liberal tradition, you can understand that maybe there are some of the differences you're gesturing at, if I'm taking your point correctly and not getting it backward, that part of the reason why Hobbes might be willing to set the bar relatively low is because he's dealing with subjects. I mean, he's literally dealing with people who have to, under an absolute sovereign, all they really have to be trusted in is to keep their hands off other people's property, not to harm other people, to obey the law, right? Whereas when you move into a Lockean political community, there's much more expectation in terms of people's ability to guide themselves under reason rather than having a heavy-handed sovereign lowering over them at every moment. So I think that might, in and of itself, as you say, regime type or even political ideology might have something to do with how stringent these capabilities are, how high or low we set the bar. So is that what you're getting at? Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and that's a good insight.
Hi, my name is Stephen Fogarty. I'm a McGill grad and an immigration lawyer in Montreal for the last 25 years or
terrific.
so. And I really found your talk very interesting today, and I thank you for being here today.
Thanks.
I wanted to just briefly mention as a point of historical interest, you might not be aware that the new Immigration Minister of Canada was the Dean of the Faculty of Arts at McGill years ago, and he would have presided over meetings in this very same council room. The Honourable John McCallum, who was sworn in on November 4th under Mr. Trudeau's administration. I also teach courses every year for the Quebec Bar Association for other lawyers on the interplay between criminal law and immigration policy in Canada, which is, I see, obviously something that interests you in your own studies. There was a lot of points that we could comment on in your talk, but there are two things I wanted you to perhaps address. And I'm not familiar entirely with the American system as to how one eventually becomes a citizen after entering the country as an immigrant. In Canada, in the last couple of years, under the old Harper regime, as we will use the word, the Citizenship Act was modified to make it much more difficult for permanent residents to become citizens. The rule was basically changed from having to reside in Canada for 3 years out of the previous 4 before applying for citizenship to require 4 years out of the previous 6 when applying. As well, they put in a whole bunch of rigmarole issues which basically said that if you are outside of Canada for more than 6 months in a particular calendar year, more than twice, none of those other periods will count. So this looked like a neutral rule on its face to try to encourage people to have a stronger tie to the country, but critics argued that this was basically aimed at excluding Middle Eastern Muslim businessmen who, as a cultural quality, you might say, tend to travel a lot on business, and therefore, because of their business interest in the Middle East, the Gulf states, wherever, are not ever going to possibly satisfy this requirement. So that, we supposedly have a neutral rule, but it's in fact aimed at this particular group in society, as I say, mostly Middle Eastern or from other areas. So I think that's kind of a point which you raised in your talk as to how law can be used as a tool with apparently neutral purposes or laudable purposes, but really acts as an exclusion tool. Maybe you'd like to comment on that, and I have one other point maybe to bring up too.
Yeah, maybe a quick comment, because lamentably I'm a social and political theorist, and I really don't know as much about the nitty-gritty of the law as I ought to, as somebody who's interested in these kinds of issues. I do know, though, that there is some analog to the kinds of requirements that you describe in America, whereby, I don't remember if it's 6 months or a year, but if you're somebody who is a permanent resident, right, a green card holder in the United States, that there's a certain amount of time that you have to be in the United States before you're eligible to apply for citizenship, and it changes. It was 5 years at one point. It's moved around, and I haven't kept up with this as much as I should. But there's some statutory time period where you have to be in the U.S., presumably to establish that you have acculturated, right? You've assimilated yourself to American values sufficient to the point where you've had a look at us, we've had a look at you, you kept your nose clean for a certain amount of time. Now we feel confident initiating you into the goods of American citizenship. There's also a similar residency requirement built in whereby you cannot be out of the country for a certain amount of time. And a lot of people don't even realize this exists. So people, for reasons of business or sometimes family life, they may have a spouse who's a permanent resident. They leave the country thinking that the permanent resident means actually permanent, and then upon arrival back in the country after being out for a couple years or 18 months or so, they suddenly discover that that person's permanent residency has been revoked by virtue of them having been out of the country for too long. So as far as whether I don't know enough about how that operates in practice to think whether that has a kind of differential impact on some groups of people as opposed to others. I would tend to think that it probably was not, if it does have such an impact, it wasn't in the American case deliberately aimed at any particular group, although I'm just not acquainted enough with how this operates on the ground to know if there is in fact some group that ends up being disproportionately burdened by that. But yes, analogs of both of those policies in terms of how it operates in the U.S. That's the best I can do, so yes.
Well, I was using that as an example of, I thought, one of the ideas that you had brought out is how law can be used as a tool. Historically in Canada, a lot of these things have gone up and down, residency requirements have been made easier or stricter, depending on which party might be in power. It's the same thing, for example, in the course I teach for the Barreau, for example, up until 2002, an individual who was a permanent resident of Canada who was convicted of a serious crime had the right to appeal for humanitarian grounds not to be deported, even if he had committed murder or attempted murder or what have you. And then in 2002, they changed the rules so that if you were sentenced to jail for 2 years or more, you had no right of appeal, so you were deported automatically. And about a year and a half ago under Harper, that fell to any sentence of 6 months or more. And at the same time, the Parliament imposed a whole bunch of minimum sentences in a lot of crimes for 1 year or greater, so that like a lot of permanent residents who might make one mistake they would automatically be deported and their families torn apart. That's the kind of an example of rules going up and down. But the second point the issue I wanted to touch on, maybe you could comment on, is, and I don't think you directly related to this, is there a justification that we can make in society to have one set of rules to allow people to live as a permanent resident in the country versus another set of rules to become a citizen? Like, should it just be automatic after a few years that you become a citizen, or should there be other requirements tagged onto that? And I gave the example of what happened in Canada recently, how they changed the rule, but it might be, I don't know, that you have to own property or what have you. You must have 2 kids who went to McGill or something. There could be like some kind of rules like that. Because it could be theoretically possible to say we have a really fair system which allows people to become permanent residents quite easily, but then we have super strict rules to who can vote and who can become a citizen. And maybe that would be a fair system too. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly if this gets at the issue you've identified, but I'm really of two minds of this, right? That there's a part of me that wants to say that if someone is living within a territory and somebody is economically incorporated into our life, somebody's living in our communities, their children in our schools, that they ought to, at some level, have the right to participate in the government and the regime that's governing over them. That this condition of alienage, there's something... we might want to insist upon this condition of alienage for a certain period of time for everyone who wants to become a citizen, but that the notion of a permanent alienage, whereby people would either not be allowed to apply for citizenship or would be permitted not to apply for citizenship, that somehow there's something untenable about that. There's something morally problematic about that. That's one of the few parts of Michael Walter's argument I think I actually agree with, that if you're going to have people in your territory who are there permanently, you've got to give them some pathway or access to citizenship. Otherwise, they become a kind of permanent disenfranchised minority. That being said, and here's where I put my other hat on, of a different mind, one of the reasons why I think people, at least in the United States, are more jealous of immigration and are less willing to open up borders is the concern that people who come to the United States are going to take advantage of our lavish healthcare system, lavish immigration, lavish social welfare network. Lots of laughs here in Canada about that, but that's the way it's presented, at least in public discourse. I'm kind of open to the idea that you could have an arrangement whereby if some people wanted to come and live in your country permanently, but were willing to forego their right to access public benefits, if that, for strategic reasons, that would encourage people to open up borders and to make it more possible for more people to come to America, I would almost, for kind of second best solution, be willing to go along with something like that. And I know the two things, I'm not disguising this, those two propositions contradict one another. So I really am of two minds on that. That it's bothersome, right? And somebody like Hannah Arendt would say it's extremely dangerous to have a two-tiered system where there's one set of privileges and immunities that are available to some people, most notably the right of voting and being able to participate in the political process, and then there's some other lesser bundle of rights accessible to some other group of people. And those two groups are somehow frozen in time. There's no way from moving from one caste or one status to the other. I think that's bothersome. I think it's even dangerous. So is that, yeah, that's, yeah.
Thanks. I just have a very quick question. I was curious, do you think there's a moral distinction between who we choose to admit and who we don't wind up expelling from a society, or is that purely a pragmatic concern, or perhaps that's what the incarceration system is kind of picking up the slack on that one? I'm just curious if there's any argument there.
Yeah, I guess the baseline for me in terms of thinking about it morally would be that the two would be in some sense symmetrical to one another, that the very same criteria by which we would decline to admit someone would also be sufficient grounds to expel them if we made a mistake and let them in, and then they manifest something that some criminality that we didn't detect the first time around, that the two things should be symmetrical to one another. So that would be my baseline intuition, that it's in or out, and therefore the criteria and the benchmark ought to be exactly the same in both cases. So then what would be required to persuade me to introduce some asymmetry into that? Maybe the notion that by having committed a crime in our country, it's important that someone do their time or pay their debts to our society, in which case, rather than throw them out, we punish them in America for what they did in America. The notion, as we find sometimes, that the troublesome is that you think, well, people do really bad things. Rather than put them in American prison, we'll just send them back home, and that'll really show them. The problem is that you get people who repeatedly commit crimes in America, and rather than being kept in American prisons, they end up being deported and then come right back across the border and commit exactly the same crimes. So for prudential reasons, you might want to introduce some asymmetry into the relationship to prevent some of these problems of recidivism. So is that, I haven't thought much about that, but is that what you're trying to get at? With
sort of. I was actually more interested in the question of natural-born Americans, not people who have immigrated to the United States, but who are born there. Why not expel these individuals?
Well, you would have to ask your colleague, Brianna, my former undergraduate PhD student who has written on exactly that subject of expulsion and of exile. And I say this in all seriousness, she's thought much more deeply about that issue than I have. So I would defer to her and how she would resolve that issue. I guess in point of fact, right, we do treat natural-born criminals, by and large, differently than we treat alien criminals, that there's some asymmetry in the treatment. The question would be whether that's something that's justifiable. Is that right? You're sort of nodding. No? Okay.
Yes, okay. So the phenomenon about immigrants more likely to become criminals, is this because of that's just the thing, or is it because of more deeper issues such as poverty and social exclusion, or it's just something that we want to see, so we see?
Well, I guess the easy glib answer is it's something that we want to see, so we see, or something that some people want to see, so they see it there. It's a hard question. Right? What the explanation, if you try to unpack what is the mechanism or the assumption behind people who want to make that argument that people coming from certain parts of the world tend to be drug dealers or tend to be criminals or tend to be people who have bad character. I think part of the assumption is that there's some adverse selection effect, right? That's sort of what Donald Trump said. If you read him, if you grant him a more careful reading, I don't think he strictly said that all Mexicans are this way, strictly, right? He didn't actually say that all Mexicans are this way. He said that they're sending the bad ones over to the United States. So one argument might be that I'm not saying that people in any country are more or less inclined toward crime than any other. It's just that the ones who tend to come to the United States, the ones who are brazen enough to violate our immigration and naturalization laws, tend also to be the ones who violate other laws in our country, in which case it's not a characterological attribution to a people so much as an adverse selection effect. The other explanation is the one that you never hear from people making these arguments, the one that you offer, that it's not that people who come to America are adversely selected based on their criminality, but that coming to America and being undocumented puts you in lots of positions where you are subject to, you're vulnerable. You may have to take it into your hands to defend you because you don't have the same protections under the rule of law as other people. You can't pick up the police to deal with disputes in the same way that somebody whose citizenship status is settled, or just conditions of poverty whereby, you know, people who are poor and desperate are, I would imagine, much more inclined to commit crimes of desperation than are people who have other options in life and people who have much more to lose under the circumstances. You almost never hear that explanation of this putative criminality of certain immigrant groups. There's the other question, though, whether it's just something that we want to imagine. I mean, the statistics are lies, right, and statisticians are damn liars, so you can quote statistics on both sides of this, but nobody has been, to my satisfaction, been able to demonstrate that immigrants, or indeed immigrants from particular countries, are that much more likely to commit crimes or certain kinds of crimes or crimes in general than are natural-born citizens in the United States. Now, again, there's different ways of parsing and different ways of slicing and dicing the numbers. What do you count as a crime? What do you count as being natural-born versus naturalized? I've seen statistics that would seem to suggest that there is, in fact, some greater likelihood that people from certain parts of the country are going to commit murder, say, than people who are natural-born citizens. But the statistical evidence for that seems to be almost non-existent, and most of the people making those arguments, interestingly, don't offer any statistical evidence. It's anecdotal. One newspaper clip of some Salvadoran gang member who committed a mass murder, right, and somehow that's supposed to stand in as a proxy for evidence of the likelihood, the greater propensity of Salvadorans to join gangs as opposed to immigrants from New Zealand or people who were born in Cleveland, right? I think that people who make these arguments tend not to parse things out quite as carefully as you have. And I think that's one of the problems with these arguments.
Steve, then Kieran, then Frederick.
Hi. So I'm just confused, or maybe, can you hear if I speak here? Yeah. Worried that you're suggesting, okay, so a stronger capabilities approach often gets tied to the exclusion of specific groups who don't meet the criteria for the moral order of the society they want to be led into.
Yes.
And so we need to set the bar much lower, and it's going to be less likely to be tied to specific groups. But I worry then that you actually end up letting back in a stronger form of the capabilities approach, since in times of crisis, moralism tends to increase, right? To blame certain groups for bad stuff that's happening. And it seems that whatever is happening at the border is in a certain way a state of permanent crisis, since there are always going to be many people who jump much higher than a very low bar. There's lots of non-murderers. There's lots of people who are basically fine according to the standards you set. And the question is how to distinguish between those ones. And at that point, we seem to revert back to a stronger capabilities approach if we've let the capability approach in the first place. So I was just wondering how you respond to that.
It's a problem, and I'm not sure. You've stated the problem very well, but you've stated it at some level of abstraction. Let me try a particular case and see if maybe this clarifies at least how I would see the capabilities approach cashing out. So there's a great debate right now, I would assume in Canada as well as in the United States. What do we do about Syrian refugees? Right. So, and one of the arguments that's being made about why in the United States we should not let in Syrian refugees, and I believe Donald Trump is one of the great proponents of this theory as well, is that these Syrian refugees aren't really refugees. They're really clandestine Al-Qaeda sympathizers or ISIL sympathizers, and they've just used this whole humanitarian crisis thing as a ruse to gain admission to the United States. Now, I don't want to rule out the fact that among the many people clamoring to come to Canada, to Western Europe, to the United States, who are Syrian refugees, there might not among them be some who have some sympathies for radical Islam, for Al-Qaeda, or maybe they don't have it now, but they come to the United States down the road and they develop some such affinity down the road. I don't think you can rule that out. And insofar as we could identify among somebody who proposed to be a humanitarian refugee from Syria, if we could do some minimal due diligence and establish that this person does have some affinity for some terrorist organization or somebody's a criminal in their own country, then I think the Hobbesian argument would say, you don't let them in. The people like Donald Trump would want to say there's a crisis, right? These people are dangerous. They're coming from a dangerous part of the world, and therefore Hobbesian justifications would keep them out. I actually don't think it's Hobbesian justifications, though, that are sufficient to do that work. What I really think, and the subtext behind all this seems to be not so much that there's a couple of clandestine Al-Qaeda members who are hiding out amongst Syrian refugees. The fact that this has been raised about Syrian refugees seems to stem from the fact that they are Muslims and Arabs by and large, coming from a part of the world that we recognize as being in some way civilizationally alien to us. And it's that attribute of their situation, and it's that stereotype that's being attributed to them, rather than more minimal Hobbesian argument that's being used to justify keeping them out. So again, there's probably some way in which in practice and social theory, these very clean categories and these very clean ideal types get blurred together. But I think the case that I have in mind for something like that, an emergency crisis, what worries about some group of people, it's as much the civilizational, the high bar kinds of arguments that do the exclusionary work as it is, we have to make sure that among the people we let in, we don't let terrorists and other sympathizers in. Does that help at all? Are you getting at an even more general point than that one?
I think it helped. Perhaps an alternative example, also using the Syrian crisis. Someone tweeted another person who was a Syrian refugee was Steve Jobs. Right? Someone once tweeted this with a picture. And so the implication, of course, being that we should let in Syrian refugees because they might become tech entrepreneurs or something like this. They might be hardworking people. And I'm not exactly sure then about how you're able to draw a distinction between that kind of capabilities approach and the much lower one. I mean, I can see how, and maybe in a very, very pragmatic sense now, politically, there are things we should do to save people's lives. I guess it is a problem of the justification of the principles that you're using then, which seems to be that you're sliding a few things together that I'm not sure that it works. Anyway, thanks for your response.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'll think more about whether, in fact, there isn't some sliding or blurring as you're describing it. Yeah, thanks.
Hi. I wanted to ask you why I should understand you as introducing this new capacity approach to citizenship, rather than just more carefully articulating the three myths that you started with. And before I hand it over to you, let me just make it a little sharper. I loved the way you carved through the three liberal myths, kind of pushing to the side what was ridiculous or false about them. But you weren't as concerned about teasing out what might be true in them, even though you suggested there's some truth to these. You think about the idea of liberty being natural, or going along with natural rights. That can be understood as given or automatic or inevitable, natural in that sense. That's the ridiculous sense. It can also be understood as appropriate or best suited or the best form or distinctively human. This sense of natural goes along very naturally with your idea that liberty takes a lot of work, or it has to be tied to a set of a particular legal system. With consent, it's not the idea that a good or liberal society is one in which everyone has actually given consent, but this hypothetical idea of consent, that we know something important about how a society should be organized when we take the view that it should be organized in such a way that all citizens could have reasonably given consent to the laws. Same thing with the principles of justice, something along the lines that they're not just justifying in an entrenching way, but but in a critical way, so that when we notice these arbitrary distinctions, like which side of the Rio Grande you were born on, we don't just try to justify the system we have, but we use those exact same tools as a resource to kind of problematize and reform that system. And all those all the like the good side of those myths or different interpretations of the subtleties within those myths seem to be exactly what you rely on. Yeah, so why not frame your why shouldn't I think of the framing of your project as like enriching these three liberal myths?
Well, I guess, let me think about how to respond to that. Well, first of all, thank you. I'm glad that you found at least one part of my analysis to be helpful and persuasive. Unfortunately, and this gets to answering your question, I think that part of my analysis and presentation is also the one that is least original to me. Right? So then I really do see this kind of capabilities approach or this capabilities insight to be the part that I'm bringing to the table, something that's new and that's different in the issue that other people have not explored, or at least haven't pushed in the same direction that I'm trying to push it. I think that one. I don't want to say this. The reason why I'm inclined to go in the direction that I'm going, after having gone through and demystified the three liberal myths, is because after having gone through and shown how neither of these three insights or these three stories based on liberalism prove particularly helpful in actually telling us how to allocate citizenship, the one conclusion would be to simply throw up one's hands and say, well, liberalism is useless on these issues. Liberalism is hopelessly idealistic on the one side in that it says that we should just give citizenship to everybody, or it's agnostic to the issue, complacent in the sense that it simply just defers to whatever arbitrary, anachronistic, feudal system that we happen to have in place by which we allocate citizenship to people or don't allocate citizenship to people. I'd like to think, as somebody who tries to be a liberal political theorist and tries to mine the liberal tradition for insights, that liberalism can be explored in a way that's actually useful, that provides something like an affirmative standard, something at least to think about in terms of potential criteria for selecting would-be liberal citizens, but to also be aware of the baggage of this liberal tradition that we carry around and the way in which some of the same kinds of liberal assumptions play themselves out in public discourse, and we aren't even aware of the work that's being done by them. Like, it's easy to look at the arguments of somebody like a Donald Trump, or look at the arguments of some of the other people who are against immigration in the United States, and assume that it's some kind of ascriptive, illiberal prejudices that are doing the work there. And I don't want to discount that, right? I don't want to say that there isn't a healthy measure of stereotyping, a healthy measure of nativism, a healthy measure of xenophobia, and other illiberal sentiments that are underwriting a lot of these arguments for closing borders and a lot of these arguments for excluding. But I think one of the things that really changed my way of looking at it is that even though these may rely upon stereotypical views of certain groups of people that are illiberal or ascriptive or nativist, the actual arguments that they're making are based on liberal principles, right? You as a good liberal agree that we need people to be hardworking, don't you? Yes, we want hardworking citizens in America. We don't want to let in people who are lazy. Oh, and by the way, you know who's lazy and who doesn't want to work hard? The people who come from, I don't know, New Zealand, right? It's ascriptive liberal ideas working hand in hand with these embedded assumptions of liberalism that are the warp and the weft of exclusion. So I think what I try to do in the paper, and what I would pitch as being the justification for doing it the way that I'm doing it, is that we really need to be attentive to that. If it's just Donald Trump screaming bad things, hateful things about Mexicans, I don't think people would take him, well, people already don't take him very seriously, but lots of people people like Samuel Huntington are taken seriously, and they're really saying more or less the same thing that Donald Trump is saying, albeit in a social scientific language. So to the extent to which we can find the ways in which people hide behind these liberal assumptions, the way in which the liberal assumptions themselves are doing some of the exclusionary heavy lifting, I think that's in and of itself a useful contribution. I hope. At least that's what I think I'm doing.
At least 6 people waiting, and possibly myself. Let's see how much more we can do.
I'll try to keep my comments more brief, too.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I won't make it so long. Okay, so I'm just trying to put the finger on the sort of normative underpinning of and contextual, the context from which you speak of. It seems that so let me say something and say why I find your talk a little unclear on that. So in Canada, the way we approach immigration, at least as far as I know, it's not so much that we have to deal with immigrants. It's that we need immigration for various reasons, whether it be economic or demographic. So it's not that we have to simply choose who comes. We have to actually seek immigrants. We go in countries. And for a long time we just needed to build trains, so we went to Ukraine or these countries and just, well, we'll give you land and you build trains, and that's going to be good, train tracks rather. But that was a capability approach right then. Are you capable of being a farmer in the West and so on? But now
software engineer or something.
Exactly.
Today, yeah.
But now the point system is much more complicated, but it's not. But that's a different context than having to deal with people going across borders because they can't live where they're from, or because and they can actually do. Canada, we have the luxury of having very, very big natural borders, which are hard to get across. But I'm wondering what justifies immigration in the first place in your talk? Because in my example, what justifies immigration for Canadians or by Canadian standards is that we need immigrants.
Yeah, your problem in some sense may be the flip side of the problem that we face, in that in America, we also struggle with some of the same problems that you struggle with, in that we do seek, I mean, there are lots of jobs in the United States where at least allegedly there are no American workers who are willing to do those jobs because they lack the skills, or there's other opportunities for them that pay more. So we're in a position where, like you, we seek around the world certain workers who have skills that are complementary to our workforce. I think the difference that you yourself underscored is that in the United States, not only are we in a position of looking for certain kinds of immigrants in an international market, the kinds of immigrants whose skills are complementary, which we don't currently have, but we're, unlike you, faced with being overwhelmed by lots of would-be immigrants whose skills are not complementary to the skills of people who are already in the United States but are directly competitive with them. So we're facing perhaps a qualitatively different issue in the U.S. than you're facing. So it's more a matter of screening, of filtering, of figuring out among those people who would come to the United States who might very well improve their own lot in life, how many of those people can you afford to bring into the United States, especially if that comes at the expense of, say, the least advantaged American worker, the least skilled American worker who has to compete against them. And my own view is that in America we're probably drawing that line a bit too tightly than we should, that we should be more willing to accommodate the needs and aspirations of other people coming to the United States, even if they are directly competitive with current American workers, or even if at the margins there's some incremental diminution of wages or of lifestyle in America. If it benefits other people so much more, it seems to me a small sacrifice at the margins for us to make to let in a lot more people, even if it diminishes a few people at the margins. So I really do think it's interesting you put your finger on it, but I think it's a different issue. Yeah.
Well, then what justifies by virtue of what principle would you bring in more immigrants to the United States of America? That's the question that you don't, but anyway.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm accustomed to thinking about it from the other vantage, right? In a world where we want to respect the freedom and autonomy of other individuals, in a world where we want to respect the aspirations of all people around the world, the default position in my mind from a moral vantage is of everybody being able to move anywhere they want. So the way I'm always approaching it is, on what grounds are there sufficient reasons for us to exercise coercion over others to prevent them coming into the United States? And I do acknowledge that there's probably some tipping point beyond which we simply cannot accommodate everybody in the world who'd want to come to the United States or to Canada or to other countries. And the question is, what are the criteria then, accepting that you can't take in everybody, what are the criteria by which you're going to narrow the pool? And I guess the capabilities approach is my way to try to identify some people who you'd want to privilege or prioritize, and then to be aware of some of the ways in which you're excluding, either advertently or inadvertently, other groups of people. Does that help? Yeah. So I just, maybe this is a quirk of my background or my thought, but I just think about it the opposite way.
Just to bridge the empirical gap there a little bit, there is absolutely tremendous unmet demand among poorer and less skilled people in the world for the right to immigrate to Canada. It's sociologically different for two reasons. One is Canada doesn't have a direct land border with a significantly poorer country. Yeah. And the other is that for at least 2, maybe 3 generations, Canada has much more rigorously excluded poorer immigrants in the first place, and therefore there's not a right of family reunification, whereas the United States has had relatively more open immigration from poorer countries and not remotely the same level of citizenship for sale at the highest levels. That therefore means now you have people who have a family connection into the United States. That doesn't mean there aren't poor people who would want to come to Canada. It means that they're relatively invisible. They're off stage. Eric was next. Yeah.
So thank you for your talk. So you got me we had our previous prime minister always liked to say the phrase taxpayers instead of Canadians or citizens. And so that got me, on the topic of discussing two-tier systems, it got me thinking about, well, what if tax-paying became our civic virtue par excellence? What would a culturally appropriate immigration policy that reflected our virtue of tax-paying be like? I guess the implication I'm trying to draw is that it seems like the liberal myths of human rights and trying to help people who, need to come here because they're refugees or whatever, really does conflict with the idea that we want people to be industrious and hardworking taxpayers. Yeah. And if tax-paying was that thing, and you needed to pay taxes for 5 years at some minimum level before you got citizenship, even if you were a born Canadian, or something some crazy system like that, can liberalism even reconcile those two things?
Yeah, well, you may have put your finger on one of the reasons why, deep down, I keep gravitating back toward Hobbes as offering a more morally defensible, more satisfactory, more imminently inclusive solution to this problem than Locke. I guess I'm uncomfortable, as I think most of us would be uncomfortable, thinking about citizenship as being the kind of thing that you offer to the highest bidder, or that somehow one's political representation should be roughly proportional to one's contribution on one's tax return at the end of the day. I mean, the logic of that view is that why don't we just sell citizenship on eBay, right? And those of us who are current citizens, we should have the right to sell that off to somebody who's the higher bidder. I guess at the margins, right, at least in the United States, there is some opportunity. If you're somebody who pledges to, I believe, start up a business or invest a certain amount of capital in the U.S. and start a business that employs a certain amount of employees, we'll give you permanent residency to come to the United States. And maybe there's some analog of that in Canada as well. At the margins, we do, in some sense, defer to or create special pathways for people who are Promethean job creators, right, or especially hard workers, entrepreneurs. And at the margins, I'm willing to entertain exceptions like that. But it seems just a very, very pernicious distributive principle to think that somehow citizenship should be commensurate to tax paying. Then does that mean people who don't pay taxes aren't citizens, right? Then we're back at classical republicanism, where only the patricians are the ones who rule over all the rest of us. And so I guess it's an interesting thought exercise to see where that argument would run. And I don't doubt but that there's some Lockean direction that's implicit there. I'm reluctant to go that route. Yeah, interesting.
I'm going to try to gather 3 questions from people on this side of the room who've been waiting for a while, and we'll see whether common themes emerge that you can say something about quickly. First.
Are there any states you deem have a healthy immigration policy, and what is it about their policy that you find so desirable or interesting?
Thank you. Let me get my pen here to jot these.
Thanks for your time and for your speech, and for letting us know about your work. If I understood well, one of your arguments is that an ideal, or not ideal, but the most less inclusive system will be one based on the Hobbian argument, because it throws the the criteria are really low, but I find that there is a big flaw with this, in the sense that if we're basing the granting of citizenship on being able to respect laws that obviously reflect our values, what about the simple fact that laws are socially constructed and that they can be actually very flawed or very destructive for society? Mm-hmm. To be more straightforward, for example, before the 60s, the U.S. was characterized by laws of segregation, in which its own citizens were limited from certain rights. So what does it mean by this? So do we have to grant the citizenship to people who are able even to respect and protect the laws, even those that are flawed, mm-hmm. even those that are corrupted, you can say? And even if this is that's basically the flaw I find on the Hobbian argument. Thanks.
My comment was actually probably extends to the previous comment. The problem I find with going back to this kind of Hobbesian minimalist criteria is I feel that don't you think that applying Hobbes in a contemporary context of the level of diversity we're dealing with and the kind of context he was writing, which was the people he was writing was like almost homogeneous, like the religion and etc. None of these issues he was not concerned with these issues. So, and considering how much maintenance of law and order and peace is the priority for him, rather than like more substantive questions, like you said, higher bars, would he actually like even consider, immigrating people of such different backgrounds, which would potentially be harmful to peace and law and order? Mm-hmm.
If I could lump maybe the second and the third question together, because it seems like they're getting at some of the common problems, some of the common baggage here with Hobbes. Maybe I'm open to the idea. I just love Hobbes a lot. I may be open to the idea that I'm trying to have my Hobbesian cake and eat it too. So I may very well be guilty as accused here. But just in defense of the way in which I'm trying to use Hobbes, I guess I'd like to say that I'm not saying that the political communities that we live under should necessarily be organized on Hobbesian lines. I'm trying to suggest that in terms of Hobbes's understanding of what it means to be a member of a political community, right? Not necessarily one's duties or obligations, but in terms of what it means to be a member of a political community, that the minimum that you need to expect from citizens is they do in fact obey the laws. One of the interesting things about the question of, invidious distinctions within a Hobbesian political community, or how Hobbes would respond to something like Jim Crow laws or segregation or other kinds of problems of racial exclusion, I think it's kind of interesting both as a point of intellectual history and as well as an interpretive point. I tend to think Hobbes actually does better on those issues than Locke does. And that interestingly, when it's a matter of race and of slavery and of exclusion and inequalities, it's actually Lockean, if not Locke himself, Lockean arguments that are often brought to bear in trying to argue why some group of people is irrational, right? Or some group of people is quitteth reason and therefore ought to be enslaved or ought to be under the dominion of some other group of people. Hobbesian arguments, not that they can't go in that direction, but it's much harder, I think, to bend Hobbes to that end because everybody is equally subject, right? You may not have a heck of a lot of rights in a Hobbesian political community, but nobody has more or fewer than you. So there's a way in which I think Hobbes, if followed to the logic of his argument, ends up with defending something like a kind of civic equality. Now, would Hobbes be in favor of inviting into the country lots of people who are inclined to protesting and to engaging in civil rights demonstrations and other kinds of things? Probably not, right? Probably Lockean citizens who are more revolutionary, who appeal to higher laws. Maybe there's something more in common with the Lockean view. But I think that's independent of and freestanding from the views of the characterological requirements for membership, as opposed to the obligations and prerogatives that are incumbent upon people who are already members. I tend to think that you can disaggregate those two parts of Hobbes and Locke's theories, and that Hobbes comes off looking much better than Locke. On the homogeneity issue, I think it relates there as well. Hobbes' argument is not necessarily that you have to have everybody in a political community who's being homogenous. He's saying that you ought to, if you're a sovereign, tolerate as much religious diversity as you can that's consistent with civil order. And I don't think as a general proposition that Hobbes is wrong about that, right? That there's some forms of diversity that become socially difficult, that create challenges for the maintenance of political order. And my reading of Hobbes is that a wise sovereign would go and toe that line as much as possible. Ironically, it's Locke who argues against certain forms of toleration, right? That we tolerate everybody unless you're an atheist or unless you're a Catholic, right? Or unless you're somebody whose religion is bizarre and violates the tenets of society. So again, I think Hobbes understood and read sympathetically comes out better on those issues. Healthy models of nations, I don't know specific names, but many European nations where refugee rights, it's very, very easy for somebody to demonstrate that if their life is in danger, right, they go to the front of the line. I don't think the United States is as good in that as it ought to be. We place a lot of barriers in terms of people demonstrating that there's that they have to have reasonable fear that if they're sent back to their country that their life will be in danger. Other countries, it's simply taken at face value. If you come from certain parts of the world, your life is in meaningful ways at risk, and therefore we'll take you. So rather than privileging the software,
I'm afraid on that I have to cut us off, and others have a right to the room now. I hope that you will come back and join us for the lecture in 2 weeks' time on the Crown and the Canadian Constitution. And we now invite you to join us outside this room for a reception. And please join me in thanking Richard Boyd.
Thank you.